Hello, and welcome to the At the Table podcast presented by JaneWallStreet. I am your host, Deirdre. Today's guest is Sara Gotfredson. Sara is the founder of Trailblazing Sports Group. Founded in 2022, Trailblazing is a mission-driven, female-founded sports media and sponsorship firm dedicated to blazing trails and facilitating brand partnerships in women's sports. Prior to this, Sara spent over 20 years at ESPN and Disney in sales and marketing partnerships, climbing the ranks from digital sales at ESPN.com to vice president of global client sales and marketing partnerships. There, she collaborated with Fortune 100 companies and led West Coast sales and partnerships and was responsible for over $1 billion of annual revenue for ESPN. That's billion with a B. Welcome to the show, Sara.
Thank you, Deirdre. It's so great to be with you, and congratulations on the success of JaneWallStreet. I love to see it.
Thank you. Well, I want to set the table with your background, and it's fun to be reconnecting with you over this podcast and just lately in general. We met at ESPN.com in 2005, where we were both working in digital sales. Can you share a little bit about how you landed a job at the worldwide leader in sports at the time when this was one of the most coveted jobs in media and sports? Because I get asked that question all the time, but your experience was a lot different than mine.
Yes, 100%. And it's crazy to think that was over 20 years ago. So I think my answer is the same as how we've come to get reconnected, which is relationships. So I was working at a competitor to ESPN, CBS Sportsline, back in the day, but I had a great frenemy / I was always pitching against Ali Dib, who you know well.
Of course. Shout out Ali Dib.
And in San Francisco. And the San Francisco market, at that time, digital was pretty nascent, and we were, running around doing creative deals, me for CBS Sportsline, Ali for ESPN.com. And sometimes we would even co-host, Final Four watch parties at the local sports bar in San Francisco together. So really just getting that relationship with Ali and then his leadership in San Francisco and on the West Coast. And when Ali wanted to move back to New York with ESPN, I was the first person that he thought of to recommend to take his role. So, relationships have been key for me throughout my career, not just with clients, but with peers like yourself. And I have a poster in my office, which is the Beatles quote, which is, "I get by with a little help from my friends." And I think that was true 25 years ago when I started in this business to what I'm doing today in Trailblazing. So
yeah, there are so many great folks from that era of ESPN.com that have gone on to so many great, roles, organizations. I'm thinking of all of them because we had such a great kind of like class of folks at the time. Interestingly, I had started in San Francisco at CNET.com and moved to the East Coast with them and ultimately ended up at ESPN in New York. But at the time that we're talking about, for listeners that really don't have as much context, like those times were the very beginning of digital marketing. Like I remember ESPN hiring me from CNET, which was a tech platform, not sports. I had no sports background because there was very few people that could speak the language of digital media. We were very young in that position, and that's why I asked you the question. But at the same time, there was no one that had come before us. So it was 20 years ago, and what's interesting is, unlike me, you spent over 20 years at ESPN and Disney and kind of climbed through the ranks. And so I thought it would be interesting to have you talk a little bit about, some of the stories of working at ESPN for 2 decades. What was it like back then as a woman or just in general? I remember that book that came out, Those Guys Have All the Fun, and it rang very true for me. But what was your perspective? Because you really stayed there a long time and moved throughout the organization.
yeah, and I'm sure you have similar stories and thoughts from your days at Barstool too. But yes, it certainly was, I don't know, boys club or, but what I knew about ESPN and to this day is I had a lot of great male bosses and allies and people that supported me through my journey. And I too started in tech in the height of the first .com boom at Red Herring, and then moved to CBS Sportsline and then ESPN. And tech was a boys club too. So,
Yeah,
I
of
think
course.
even back in those days, it's not like you could walk into a room like you can today and see a lot of women around the table. And I think, that's just how it was. And so you had to really know your stuff, and you had to work hard to get a seat at that table. And then once you had that seat at the table, to continue to earn that seat. But I think for me, I never saw it as like a man versus women thing at ESPN. I think about my old bosses at ESPN.com. They were all men. It wasn't until I moved to our Chicago office where I had Sarah Torvell, who is a mentor and a good friend today, as a female boss. But then I went on to have people like Wendell Scott, who is a luminary in our business. And if I may, I will tell you the story of how I was promoted to lead the West Coast as the vice president for the whole West Coast of ESPN, which is something they did not have before. I was running the Pacific Northwest, and our friend and colleague Cherie Cohen was running LA. And I was 8 months pregnant at the time with my first, and back in New York for the upfronts, last trip. And Cherie had just resigned, and I remember coming into Ed Earhart's office, who is a Trailblazing advisor and still a really good friend, and helps me, and we connect every couple of months. And I remember coming in like a big maternity dress, and saying, Ed, I want to run the West Coast. I know I can do it. I know I'm having my first baby. I want to do it from San Francisco. I want to oversee the studios and the autos and all of the tech that I had. And he called me about a month later and said, good news, bad news. Good news, you got the job. Bad news, you got to move to LA. And so I had my first daughter, and then at 3 months old, we moved to LA to oversee the West Coast, which was, an over $1 billion territory for the Walt Disney Company and for ESPN. But I get back to the whole, male mentor and advocate thing. I don't know that people looked at me as like not thinking I could do it because I was this woman having birth for the first time. I think they looked at maybe my receipts from, the 12 years before. So yes, was it a fun time, living in that? And are there things that I'm sure you and I maybe look back at now and been like, I don't know if that would be okay now, but
of course.
But really positive times and super supportive of me and my trajectory.
Yeah, and in support of ESPN and all the folks that were our leadership there and worked there at the time, ESPN, while it is sports and just by nature of being sports, it was male dominated when we got there. It was owned by Disney, and Disney's like the ultimate family company. And so that culture did trickle down into ESPN over time. And probably by the time you were, having that opportunity, that had kind of been part of the culture. I want to get back to, again, the time in the industry that we were in. You were at ESPN.com. We were at ESPN.com long before streaming and social media. Digital was the new frontier of advertising. ESPN.com was the first website, I believe, at the time to be putting highlights on the homepage because broadband was allowing for this finally. But like before that, it was really banners and HTML. And digital media very quickly became a darling of the media industry, but it was still a rounding error for ESPN and Disney. And I remember that, I remember talking, you mentioned Ed Earhart, also at the time a mentor and friend to me, saying, hey, why are you staying at ESPN.com? There's television jobs, you should be pitching them. But that was way ahead of its time, and I wanted to stay in digital. Ultimately, to be successful at ESPN, you had to become multimedia. But talk about that, and did that give you an advantage as you grew in your role over time there? Was coming from digital and having that base of knowledge in the new medium an advantage or disadvantage at a company that was really TV-led, traditional media first from a revenue perspective for many years and still?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think having been in our San Francisco office, uh, we actually led with a lot of digital, and TV was almost an afterthought with the clients that we were working with because they were all the tech forward clients, the Microsofts of the world, the Googles, and the gaming companies. Even EA was wanting to do a lot with fantasy football and whatnot. So I think for me it was an advantage because we could like break things. Like we created, a thing called Section 140, which was essentially Twitter before there was Twitter, which
Yeah.
was a fan community, around, football and all of the things, for fans to comment on games in real time. So, and we'll get into like women's sports, but I do think there's a lot of parallels between um, building and disrupting and what we both did in digital early days to what is happening in women's sports. And I think that's why I've gravitated towards it and love what I'm doing and building at Trailblazing. Um,
Yeah.
and then I would also say I've always been one that's like curious. And so, like, what's the thing we could do? And I think that as I grew my career at ESPN into a multimedia role and into a vice president overseeing audio and linear and the magazine and all of the things, I always still wanted to like break things and do new things in linear, and I was able to do that, I think, because coming from that digital background.
Yeah. Was there a deal or partnership or client that you still today feel most proud of? Sort of, I always say to people who are in sales capacities, like your baby, so to speak, or a brand that you felt like, really embraced that mentality of let's break things or innovate and do something that's never been done before?
Yeah, I definitely think, and I think it's also, a reason why I'm doing what I'm doing now. But in working with the Google team, and Kate Johnson specifically, I don't know, this might have been 10 years ago, maybe even longer. They had just invested in a WNBA partnership. And so we were pitching them, a sponsorship of the WNBA on ESPN and across all of our different platforms. And Kate came to me and said, Sarah, I don't want to just sponsor something. Let's like create and build something. So with that partnership, we did a couple of things. One, we added games for the 25th anniversary of the league. So ESPN and Google came together and said, let's add more games to celebrate this. So there was production fees that they paid in terms of not just, sponsoring the games that we had. We put together the first studio show ever in the WNBA. It was the WNBA countdown for the finals. And then we morphed that into a playoffs, and then we morphed that into what you know today, which is a season-long WNBA countdown. And I think it's like partnerships, like building something with a partner that has a shared mission of ESPN, but also I was very passionate about like what can we do to grow the exposure of this league across ESPN. And I think I had earned that right to call the folks in Bristol to say, like, listen, we've got a brand that doesn't want to just sponsor the thing, but like let's build some things with them. And so kudos to the team, and Carol Stiff at ESPN, and Burke Magnus who agreed, and we were able to build net new products for the WNBA, which Google really endowed, if you will. So to this day, that's been a big proud moment. And Google has been a tremendous supporter of things that we do at Trailblazing as well. So
Yeah, that sounds like a foreshadow to where we're going with this conversation. But before we switch off of your time at ESPN, I just wanted to ask, like, is there anything else you would say about your time there? Or is there anything surprising that people maybe would, or something that people would be surprised to hear about your time at ESPN?
I don't know if people would think it's surprising, but I always, and you lived it, so you know this. But when we were there, I always would say that ESPN is like a startup, like a well-funded startup, and it felt like the Walt Disney Company just let us create and experiment and disrupt, and some things didn't work. I think you and I probably both worked on the ESPN the phone.
I can't believe you brought that up. I was going to say that. ESPN the phone was a massive fail.
and I wish I had it. It's somewhere in my office. And it was a massive fail from like ESPN eventually got out of the hardware game. But the development of that product with that team and John Zayer and everybody, I think that was the guts of what, the ESPN app is today.
Right.
And, again, that was 20 years ago. So really ahead of their time. So while, the physical product didn't take off like we wanted it to, it really propelled ESPN into the mobile space long before anybody else, forget about just the sports space. But, Facebook didn't even get into the mobile game until 5 years at least after ESPN did. And so
yeah, I remember those times because they were asking us to go out and try to find like a sponsor or partner for the phone, but we didn't actually have a physical phone to even take on a sales call with us.
Yeah.
Fast forward for me, I think it was 2007 when I started working at Major League Baseball Advanced Media, and the iPhone launched, in that time period that I was there, and we actually were one of the first 3 apps to be on the iPhone. I think the iPhone launched in April, so around opening day. And we sent all our mobile developers out to Cupertino to be like sequestered and build with Apple, like some of the first apps on the phone. So for ESPN to be years ahead of that, trying to enter the mobile space, says a lot about the desire to innovate, the willingness to experiment and try things. And, it definitely led to ESPN being a powerhouse in the mobile space. So I'm glad you brought that one up.
Yeah, so I think it's been, it was a great time, and I continue to cheer for them and love seeing how they're continuing to innovate with ESPN Plus. And I think Jimmy Pitaro and that leadership team is, they've got to continue to figure out how to reach that younger generation of sports fans that's fanning differently today than you and I grew up, or that our parents grew up, how they were a fan. So I think they will continue to try new things, and it was just a great part of my career, and the relationships from that, you included, has really been special.
Yeah. ESPN's trying new things. I love seeing. Most people that know me know I spent a good time at Barstool Sports, and now they've hired Pat McAfee, they're hiring Bussin' with the Boys. So it's like ESPN's taking on some of these new age personalities that are very different than your traditional sports broadcasters. So kudos to them for, continuing to push the envelope. I want to talk about Trailblazing. You launched in 2022. Maybe this goes back to your Google story, but what was the insight, the motivation that led you to believe, now going on 4 years ago, that going all in on women's sports was a smart bet? Because you were ahead of the curve on the current women's sports movement.
Yeah. I think, it was a sort of a full circle moment to be at the W All-Star Game in Chicago just this past July, because that was the last All-Star Game I was at with ESPN in 2022, and then I resigned that fall to start Trailblazing. And so in 2022, that All-Star Game was a very small fan fest. AT&T owned it. I don't know if there was any other brands that were around it. To then fast forward to 2026, and it is a huge footprint and 1,000 different brands and all these events that weren't even sponsored by WNBA partners, but I couldn't get to all of the things all weekend. So it was a full circle moment for me, because I do think, I wasn't like Carol Stiff. I feel like is like a real OG of women's sports and was pushing it, 15 years ago. But I did see from where I sat at ESPN and the brands that I worked with, there just seemed to be an uptick in conversation around, well, what can we do around women's softball? Or what can we think about for not just the women's Final Four, but like, the regular season? And how do we, think about highlighting the female Olympians, or the Women's World Cup we had on our air a couple of years ago. So we worked with Adidas on a couple of cool Women's World Cup programs. And so I saw, the signals were there. And you get to a certain point in your career too, where I wanted to just become, I just wanted to use my mind in creative ways. And I think, and I saw that women's sports, I could really help disrupt the marketplace a little bit. And then the other thing that was a signal to me was in meeting some of the current clients that we work with, some of the smaller women's sports media companies, are talking to folks. They just could use some commercial help and experience. And so our business today is really about helping and working with media companies, properties, entities, events that could use some commercial firepower and long-standing brand relationships to help advocate of why a Google or a AT&T or an EA Sports should be investing in some of these longer tail media companies, or the AUSL softball league that just started, or Unrivaled that's hitting season 3.
Yeah.
Or player associations, which is a longstanding partner of mine. So I've enjoyed, it's been the hardest thing I've ever done, but it's been the most rewarding for sure.
Yeah. So clearly a good bet to move into women's sports at the time you did. But as any entrepreneurial business, like not without its challenges, has there been things that have been difficult, or that you've had to pivot from what you originally envisioned Trailblazing Sports Group to be?
Yeah, I think, when we first started off, I was, thinking maybe we would be sort of an advisory, a brand consultancy. I had worked with our friends and partners at Optimum Sports and at, Wasserman, now the team, and I just was like, well, I wonder if we could do something where we just focus on women's sports. But at the end of the day, they all do that as well. And so, and I had only worked with big brands, right? Like that was the book of business at ESPN, was working with these big blue chip brands, and they had all these great relationships with people that are wonderful in the marketplace. So we did then pivot back to, okay, Sarah, you've been overseeing sales and selling for 25 years. So what if you just sold things on behalf of women's sports entities? And so that's really how Trailblazing has morphed into, after our first year of doing some brand consultancy, we thought, what, I think we can make a bigger impact if we represent to the broader group of brands that we have relationships with the longer tail of women's sports. And there's a lot of data to support that women's sports fans care about the story and the lives of these athletes off the field and off the court. And big media companies aren't always telling those stories, but companies like Together are telling those stories. Tobin Heath and Kristen Press podcast, the recap show, is telling that story. And so how do we get brands to support those entities in addition to showing up in the WNBA finals on ESPN? I never want brands to not spend money with the big media companies,
Right.
because that, there's a whole ecosystem, and that's really important. It's always a yes and. Yes, you should be doing the league deal. Yes, you should be doing the big media deal. and you should be supporting the athletes, and you should be supporting the long tail media, and you should be doing an experiential thing at the Women's World Cup in Brazil.
Yeah.
So that's really what we've been trying to do the last couple of years.
I love it. You write a column on LinkedIn called Trailblazing Tuesdays. This is how this popped up in my feed. This is how Sara and I ended up getting reconnected. And I think the purpose of that is to create awareness, make the case for brands to invest in women's sports, and highlight some of the things that are happening in and around the women's sports ecosystem. So I want to discuss that a little bit. I loved your recent one was titled "Show Women's Sports the Money," and they had like the Tom Cruise like "Show me the money" meme. But it was really packed with stats that are making the case for brands that they should get ahead of this now for 2027. For anyone who's not in a media buying capacity or doesn't know the cycle, like now is the time essentially to be planning. So I wanted to kind of hear from you some of those like key salient points that you're out touting to brands and potential brand partners around why they should be really kind of making this an important part of their 2027 budgeting process.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I mean, Trailblazing Tuesday is a labor of love. I usually do it late on a Tuesday night when the house is quiet and I can just get my thoughts out there. But I think what I would say, there's a lot of stats, and when I started Trailblazing, there really wasn't. Like, we had to dig to find stats that I could put into presentations to pitch brands on. So I feel great that the Trade Desk just released some stats. Nielsen just had some additional stats. So there's more data now. McKinsey's been doing an annual report on the state of women's sports. So there's more data now than ever. But I think the three things that I usually talk to brands about would be, one is the next gen fan, which is that elusive, like, Gen Z, 18 to 24-year-old. They are the highest growing concentration of women's sports fans out there. So when you look at, if you have a strategy to reach an 18 to 24-year-old man or woman, women's sports needs to be a part of your mix. So that's number one. When you look at the viewership of college football or even the NFL, it's ticking up. Even the NBA, which used to be our go-to, like, oh, you want to reach 18 to 24-year-olds, let's put you in the NBA. YouGov had a stat that there is a higher comp of men 18 to 24-year-olds watching the W than the NBA. That's a comp number, not a coverage number. But yeah. I think that's important. So next gen sports fans are watching women's sports or consuming women's sports, whether they're watching it on linear or they're streaming it or they're engaging in social media. And then I think from an ROI perspective, really where I see women's sports outkicking their coverage, if you want to use a sports analogy, is in favorability and purchase intent. So we are not winning today on the scale game. If you really need mass scale within 24 hours to launch a film, you should by all means be buying the Super Bowl or, the AFC champ game. Fine. But if you are trying to get people to, and this is a case in point, switch from an iPhone to a Pixel, then you need to be showing up again and again in spaces that are viewed by this audience, because this audience pays back those brands that are investing in those spaces. So I believe the stat is like 54% of women's sports fans will actually be loyal and purchase a product of the brands that they see showing up again and again in women's sports. So loyalty, purchase intent, we've done a lot of brand research studies when we do campaigns. Those are always the metrics that I see really, shining for brands. And I think, as the economy, ROI is important. And so I do think that is something that marketers and CMOs are paying attention to.
I think you've sort of answered this question, but my next question is going to be what's holding brands back? Is it perceived as a scale issue because big pro sports have these huge numbers, whether it's the NFL, NBA, Major League Baseball, and their jewel events or their big tentpole events? They do put up such large TV numbers, especially on broadcast. But is there anything else that you think is just holding brands back from jumping into women's sports? Is it just unfamiliar territory, or like what is the thing that you think they need to overcome to continue to see more brands coming into the space?
Yeah, I think it's probably a combination of all of it. I think that there's more places than ever to spend your marketing dollars. So whether that's in the creator landscape, whether that is in a real sort of programmatic, just I'm finding the audience and I'm serving things up to them. And so I think that brands have a lot of choices where to spend their money. And so they're going to, some brands are going to just do what they've always done, which is either men's sports, or they're going to do the easy thing, which is throw the money in a programmatic machine and just, hopefully watch it return. And so I think what I've noticed with women's sports is it's a long sales cycle. We spend a lot of time selling, brand leaders, CMOs into why women's sports, showing them the metrics, getting them to believe in it. So I think that brands will get there, and I think that all of the stats that I see is that more and more brands are increasing their spending in it, but it's not as fast as I think it should be. And I think the thing I also look at is when you look at the brand increase in spending, it is going up and to the right, which is good. But then you look at the franchise value of these women's sports teams, and I know you've talked about this on your show before.
Yes, yeah.
That's like a hockey stick. I mean, that is like a real, hockey stick. And so it's like you've got the franchise value really shooting up, and then you've got the brand value sort of chugging along. And I'm excited for the day where the CMOs wake up and they're like, oh my God, we gotta ramp the brand spending, because if really smart people in private equity firms and investment firms and family offices are seeing the value of women's sports, then we at P&G or at Samsung should also be seeing the value of women's sports.
Yeah, and it will. I believe it will. As long as the hockey stick continues to occur, the advertising industry has always come a little bit slowly along, and then boom, it happens. And that's not unlike what you and I experienced in digital advertising when we were out there, pounding the pavement, explaining to people why they should move dollars from, in my case, at CNET, it was like from print to digital, and people thought we were insane. And then eventually the numbers were undeniable and the attention was all on digital, and PC Mag went from being this thick to like a tiny little sliver of a magazine. So, and ESPN had that experience with their magazine as well, which was like a wildly successful magazine launch. Are there categories that you feel have held back that are like ripe for getting into women's sports in a bigger way that could be, make a big difference?
I think some of the categories that I haven't seen really dive into this, which they are big spenders on the men's side, is like the quick serve restaurants. I haven't seen like the McDonald's of the world or the Burger Kings or even the Chipotle's get into women's sports in the way that I think they show up in men's sports. I do think from category is a bit challenged today, just from a lot of factors. But I think that could be another category. I think tech has led, and they're in a big way. Insurance is showing up in a big way. So I think CPG has been there, and I think their spending is ramping. But I think about, I really have been thinking a lot about sort of that, the QSR and alcohol categories. How can we see them showing up?
That's interesting. When I was at Barstool, alcohol was far and away our largest category in terms of advertising. They want to reach younger, 21 plus, younger audiences, and we had that audience, and they were highly engaged, like you described, the women's sports fan. And we actually got to a point where we had to diversify away from alcohol because it was almost starting to seem like our talent were alcoholics because they were always promoting alcohol brands. But I think that will come when, those brands come into arenas and see the experience that, the fans are having. And also, we launched an alcohol brand at Barstool Sports called Pink Whitney, which is still the #1 flavored vodka brand globally. And what was interesting is we launched it in our hockey podcast and we socialized it all through the Barstool, but then it picked up a whole nother audience that was totally outside we did not have any audience that were African-American females, but the brand just appealed to that demographic and it went organically there. So I'm really excited to see that category enter women's sports. And, the other question I was going to ask you is are there non-traditional categories that you see investing in women's sports? And what comes to mind for me would be fashion and beauty coming into sports when they traditionally have ignored the sports category because it's not a place where they naturally fit in.
Yeah, I think it's been so great to see fashion and beauty really show up in a big way, and everybody's sort of doing it a little differently. And we've had a big partnership with L'Oreal, who has supported the player associations of the W and the NWSL and the U.S. Women's National Team, and it's lovely to also see these athletes feel so important, and they're getting their glam, and we need to be. As I mentioned, fans care about the lives of the athletes off the field, and so there's a natural connection to what these athletes are doing off the court with fashion and beauty. And so I think they've been smart to lean into that. I'd love to see crypto get more involved in women's sports in a healthy way. And the online betting space is tricky because of some of the vitriol that is in and around just sports betting in general, but I think it's even a higher temperature in women's sports. So there are brands like that where we have to be careful about how we work with brands like that.
Yeah. I know the prediction market companies have an eye towards just female bettors. Because of you're now betting not just on sports and in a very different way. They're creating betting around pop culture moments and just things that are more familiar, even like television programming like Love Island.
Yes.
And so that could be an interesting way in for sort of betting, so to speak, into women's sports in a little bit more of a female-friendly way. The question I asked you earlier about your time at ESPN, I'll ask you a little bit differently, but again, is there an example of whether it be a brand or maybe it's a league, given that you're focused on property sales, that you've partnered with that stands out as trailblazing?
I think we are in the early days of representing teams and leagues and whatnot, but we did just partner with the AUSL on a Zillow partnership. And it was a tremendous experience. We had been, again, talking to them for a long time, and there was some heart from their leadership to explore what softball could look like. And we worked with the team at AUSL on a tremendous partnership with Zillow to get them into the game. And when you think about sports that are going to really pop in LA 28, I would really encourage people to look at softball, surfing, and flag football. And so I think we represent different entities within all of those areas. And so, you don't need to have a big 9-figure partnership to show up in a big way with these leagues. But I think doing it now before the buzz of LA 28 is a really smart marketing tactic.
Yeah, you make a great point, which is that the entry point to getting into women's sports in a big way is the bar today anyway, obviously you don't want this to always be the case, but today it's a lower bar of entry to have a meaningful impact on any one of these women's sports, or whether it's through the media companies. So if you're a brand that's getting in, women's sports is a really great testing ground for all those reasons, and LA28 will be great. We actually just had Kim Eng, who's the commissioner of the AUSL, on my podcast, and we did an event with them down at Major League Baseball, and this week they announced another investment from a group, and I'm also very bullish on them. I think that softball, all the right kind of, you said it earlier, all the signals are there, and they just haven't had the support in the past. There hasn't been a pro entity that's been successful, but now they have the backing of Major League Baseball and other strategic investors. So we've definitely got our eyes on them. The WNBA, the NWSL, these guys are showing scale, like competing with men's sports in some cases. And you mentioned Together spelled with an X, not an E, which is for anyone that doesn't know, that's watching, a female sports media company, meaning they exclusively cover women's sports, and they're sort of a, as you described, long tail media company, emerging media company. One of the things they recently put out that I thought was a wild stat, which is like 10 of the most watched tennis matches ever were featuring Serena Williams. I don't think that's that surprising, but clearly tennis is there in terms of scale and parity with male sports. What are some of the emerging women's sports that you believe are next on the horizon? You just mentioned a few of them that have that level of like visibility, cultural relevance, and investment to get them to that level of whether it be the WNBA or the NWSL.
Yeah, well, I think I mentioned those ones, and I think the AUSL is a great example of, creating this softball league and then going city based. So then you've got fans in Portland rooting for the Cascade, but also we are Megan Grant fans because we watch UCLA softball down the street. And so I brought my daughter a Portland Cascade shirt, so now she's a Cascade fan because of Megan. So there is a lot of momentum. I think you may know this stat, but more people watch the softball World Series on ESPN than they do the men's baseball World Series. And so that was a signal that I think the AUSL had leaned into, and then their metrics year over year growth has been at like 400% year over year. So they're doing tremendous things. I would say, besides the softball, surfing, and flag, women's soccer. So here's what we have going on. So we have the Women's World Cup in Brazil with this really new, fresh-faced, but dynamic U.S. women's national team, which is projected to win the World Cup. They are going in as the favorites to win the World Cup and take that title from Spain. So then you've got that happening in 27 in Brazil on Netflix for the first time ever to have a streamer be streaming the Women's World Cup. So I'm really anxious to see what they will be doing around that. That would be a fun podcast for you to do with somebody at Netflix, because I'd love to hear. But I think they're going to be doing a lot of ancillary programming around that. Then the women will come back to LA28 and defend their gold medal, so that they won in France. And then the Women's World Cup will be on North American soil in 31. So if I were a brand thinking about what's my arc for the next, 10 years in women's sports, women's soccer, whether it's at the NWSL level, the athlete level, or the U.S. women's national team level, I think is a place to really think about.
Yeah, that is a really smart point. I think I just read this morning that this investment from Netflix in the media rights to the World Cup in the U.S. is the largest investment ever by any network in women's sports. So they're setting a precedent, and it was only recently that the WNBA and the NWSL were achieving those milestones. So it says a lot about what the investment that's going into women's sports. The measuring stick has long been TV ratings, and it still is and will be, but it is changing. Like, what is your perspective on how to measure success for maybe newer leagues like PWHL or AUSL, as you've talked about, although they're having a lot of rating success, or Love Volleyball is another one that we're hearing and talking a lot about?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard because I do think the traditional way that sports marketers and media, heads of investment on the media side still look at ratings as that measuring stick, as you said. We always try when we're doing a big program to include brand lift studies in those programs, and we always try to talk about engagement numbers, and then as we talked about, loyalty and purchase intent, and try to move the conversation from, yes, maybe it's not reaching 20 million people, but look at the people we did reach and how much they loved you being involved in this sport, and their sentiment scales were, their sentiment scores were off the charts. um, and I noticed this at Cannes when I was there this summer. So much buzz around the creator ecosystem and brands really partnering with creators, and it got me thinking, like, yes, some of them maybe have massive scale if you're talking about like Mr. Beast, but most of them are sort of these mini creators, and but brands still love to partner with them. So they must have a different metric of success that brands are measuring when they're working with their creators and their influencers. So I do think, as like the media landscape is evolving from not everybody watching the big television anymore, I think that will benefit how we think about women's sports, and the measurement of success there.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I think, for anyone that was at Cannes, they know that creators was the big buzz, but so was sports, right? Sports in
Yeah.
general, women's sports is a part of it. Sports Beach has become a massive attraction at Cannes and has brought the entire sports industry to a place that was traditionally more about the creative of advertising and maybe the media companies and the big social platforms in recent years. But I think, there's a different model and a different way of measuring. And especially if you're going after younger audiences, the networks, really struggle with reaching young audience. And if you're like you and me and a parent of teenagers, that like they're not coming back. They're not going to just turn into the couch potatoes of yesteryear. You have to figure this out. I want to ask you about fans of women's sports. This is something that I hear a lot about. Like, maybe it varies by sport, by property, maybe even by market. But are you seeing that the fans are predominantly female or no? And do brands activate differently than they do in traditional sports?
I do think it varies by sport, and it also varies on, like, if we are selling a brand into the property, the audience that is attending the game may be different than the audience that is watching the game. So, I think there was a misconception of, women's sports games as all just being like, moms and girls. But, when we talk about, this, going to a Sparks game or to a Legacy FC game up in Boston, like, it is not just moms and girls. It is high net worth dads that are maybe taking their kids, or it is, the 26-year-old, group of men and women that just want to have a great time, and be in downtown LA and go to a Sparks game and then go out afterwards. And so I think that the narrative of like only women watch women's sports is like a myth. I just talked about it in my Trailblazing Tuesday. It was like the number one thing that we have to get away from.
I should have worn my T-shirt that the folks at Together gave me that says everybody watches women's sports. They've made like a viral moment out of that T-shirt, but I love that. I think that I've always known a lot of male fans of women's basketball, and I think that as all these women's sports are emerging. I mean, I was at MLB X, which was the night before the Home Run Derby, and the women softball players playing against, MLB legends and celebrity athletes, like Terrell Owens was there. Like the celebrities of that night were the softball players, like, and they really kind of brought the energy. They had the crowd standing on their feet cheering as they hit home runs out of the park. And it was really fun to see them sort of own the night. And I think that you're just seeing that like women's sports can be a platform for everyone, not just female fans.
Yes, 100%. And I will share with you, I was at a Cubs game in Chicago during All-Star Week, and I walk into the sports bar before the game, and it must have been the Little League Softball World Series was on in the Cubs game because it was on ESPN. I mean, it was on in the Cubs bar, and it's like things like that where I just love to see it. And was with my daughter who plays, U12 softball, and it was like, look, like all these guys in this sports bar, like this is on the TV that's in the sports bar, and that was a really cool moment.
Yeah, that's always fun to see.
Yeah.
All right, switching gears a little bit, I like to ask my guests about leadership because they are all leaders in their own right. You've held leadership positions at ESPN and Disney, which is arguably the most successful media, sports, and entertainment company. And now you're building something from the ground up. So how do you take, what you learned at Disney over 2 decades from such incredible leaders there and apply it in a startup culture?
I think from a leadership perspective, I've always, it's been really important to me, no matter how big the team was, that everybody on the team is valuable. Like I used to tell the team, like, our assistant is valuable because she is making the lunch reservation or bringing in the lunch for the lunch and learn. And if that doesn't happen correctly, then the whole meeting goes off the rails. And so I think everybody, and I tell people that I've hired right out of college, I'm like, I'm not paying you to take notes. I'm paying you to take notes and then come with the point of view, because you're 22 and you probably have a different point of view than I do. And I want to hear it. And I want, you have a great college education, and so I think from a leadership perspective, I try to make sure that everybody's feeling valued around the table. And then I also, my philosophy is, ask for forgiveness rather than permission, which I really am trying to create a culture at Trailblazing, and I think I had this at ESPN, of like taking risk, trying things, going out on a limb, and because that's the kind, disruption is what's the fun part about our business, and I enjoy doing new things, and I think women's sports is ripe for that. So I encourage that with the team that I have today at Trailblazing.
I love that, taking risk, which, you and I both know is not always the easy way to do things at a company as large and corporate as ESPN or Disney. So kudos to you for being, having that mindset and then having it translate over. Is there any specific leader or person that you feel shaped who you are as a leader?
I mean, I just think I've been very blessed to have a lot of great, as I talked about. ESPN was really the place where I grew up. I had a lot of people have my back and speak my name. We always talk about, as women, having mentors and sponsors speak your name in rooms that you are not in. And, I think I had that with, again, Eric Johnson, Wendell Scott, Ed Earhart, Sarah Toiville. And so these people helped me get to where I was, in my career at ESPN. And I feel like I tried to do that when I left ESPN. It was really important to me to work with my predecessor, Jordan Wells, and she has worked for me for, 10 plus years. And I knew that when I was leaving Disney, I wanted her to get that job. And so I gave her a little heads up, and we worked on a plan, and we worked on our strategy. And I shouldn't be telling the world this, but
that's huge, and that is something that makes a huge difference. And your desire to want to pull the next person up behind you as you move on speaks volumes about your leadership style. All right. If you had a crystal ball, what's a prediction for sports and media in the next 12 to 24 months?
That's a good one. I really think that the next 24 months in women's sports is really going to, you know, not crescendo, because I think about it as a wave. I live in LA. I like the beach, but I think we're like, sort of mid crest on a wave, and so I think we're gonna, over the next 2 years, really get closer to that crest of the wave, where then we might have this. So I think about things like the Women's World Cup, things like LA 28 really booming that, but I think about emerging leagues like Unrivaled and AUSL, and I just think the storytelling and the momentum behind those leagues, coupled with all of the shine and the buzz that the W will get from LA 28 and that the NWSL will get from the Women's World Cup. So I just think you're going to have a lot of confluence of energy to continue to grow the existing leagues, and a lot of energy to buoy some of those emerging leagues, like the World Surf League with the Olympics. I think that is going to be a huge buoy for women surfing when we see these women, off the shores of LA just ripping it up in a way that I don't think they've ever been covered doing it before.
Yeah, we have a lot to look forward to here in the U.S. in the sports world from a big event standpoint, with LA 28 and the Women's World Cup coming. And I think you're right. I think it's kind of, for lack of a better term, like a perfect storm right now. The signals are there. The momentum is there. The sports are emerging in a way that those events and a handful of others are really going to be massive for women's sports. Sara, thank you so much for doing this today. By the way, you are our first remote guest, and I hope we did a good job so we can do more,
Yes.
Bring in more women from the West Coast and other places. So thank you for working through the glitches with us and making this work, and look forward to seeing you soon, whether it's out on your coast or over here on ours.
Well, I really appreciate the time, and honestly, thank you for the attention that you and JaneWallStreet has given women's sports since you've launched. I've listened to almost all of the podcasts, and it's advocates like you and your crew at JaneWallStreet that make a big difference in what we're trying to do at Trailblazing and companies that we work with. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. Thank you. And, a little self-serving plug. We have the JaneWallStreet and JaneWallStreet Female Front Office Forum happening in New York on November 12th. We'll be announcing our lineup of speakers just in a few weeks. So hopefully, Sara, you'll be there. If not, send some, of your partners, clients, and whatnot. But it's going to be a great event. A lot of great discussion around all things, not just women's sports, but that will certainly be a big part of it. So thank you, and we will talk soon. JaneWallStreet IQ is an exclusive members-only community designed for high-level sports and media executives, including team owners, league CEOs, and investors. Its membership includes C-suite executives, owners, and investors, collegiate athletic directors, and senior media tech founders. Its purpose: to help industry leaders see around corners and network with peers that are navigating the same opportunities and challenges in the sports industry. IQ members gain access to private virtual communities, thematic research reports, and in-person tentpole events. To learn more about becoming a member and joining the IQ community, head over to JaneWallStreet.com. And while you're there, don't forget to sign up for our newsletter. It's free, and it's a must-read for all executives in the sports industry. And it's where I will have a monthly newsletter for JaneWallStreet, so please subscribe.